think this is not as good because one of the key things here is when they play e4, and we answer with e5, which is our repertoire. Note that the main line is bishop e7, with the idea that you made d4 is now hanging, so like you don't mind playing back to e7 because if they go knight e5, you'll go knight takes d4. You know, it wasn't hanging with the pawn on e3, so yes, you played bishop d6 to e7, but it's not as bad as it looks. But I'm recommending this e5 because I think it's easier to play. So one of the problems here is if he does this queen e2, knight c3, and e4, and you play this system, is that you can't take back. You'd like to take back with the bishop because you'd like when he takes here and plays f4, you'd like to be able to go to d3. But the problem here is it runs into e5. And the problem here is not that the rook on a8 is hanging to, to this. The problem here is that, wow, that's an interesting arrow, g3 to a8. Woo. But the problem is when you play a move like knight g4, bishop takes a8, queen takes a8, e6, and you can't play bishop takes e6 because of f5. And you can't play, and this piece is pinned, by the queen here. And you can't play f takes e6 because the g4 knight just hangs. So in this position, so I think this is the best version of this system for white, is to play queen e2, knight c3, and then e4. And indeed, this is the most common variation. And when he plays e5, you have to take back with the knight. But this is not so bad as we've seen after f4, bishop takes e3, b takes e3. We reach the critical position of this e3 variation, in my opinion, of our line against it anyway. I mean, the bishop d6 to e7 plan is considered the main line, but I'm recommending this system. So what's going on here? White has achieved his kingside majority of 4 against 3, and he plans to play like f5, e5, and so on. And Black, meanwhile, has his 4 against 2 on the queen side and would like to play c5, b4, etc. And sometimes, even sacks the pawn and just plays b4 so that white plays in this position. See, if white still had a pawn on b2, b4 by itself would carry no real threat because he can just sit on it and ignore it. But in this position, white can't ignore b4. Like, he pretty much has to take it, and then the c pawn becomes passed and threatens the queen. So that's a theme in this line. So black's pawns are actually more dangerous than they would normally be. They're more mobile than they would normally be by virtue of white not having a b pawn. So if black can stop white's kingside play, he's going to have very good chances in this position. So the game I'm going to look at is that I've already annotated heavily is this game Tkachiev-Belyavsky from 1999, and we can see after the critical position here, I think this is black's best move, is to play c6. And I think maybe you could get away with castling, but the problem is that you'd really like to, in this position, you want to be able to stop e5 by just playing knight d5. And in this position, e6 doesn't do anything. We can just take back with the f-pawn. And even if he plays like bishop a3, thinking he's preventing us from castling, we can just castle long. So e5 is not really a threat or scary in the least here. And c6 here is clearly just, it's the control of this square is important because it's giving us our knight somewhere to go. If white tries something like bishop a3 to stop us from castling, we can just check and then play this powerful move h5, and we can just go long here. And even if he tries e5, it's important to throw in this move bishop g4 so that your bishop is on the other side of the e6 pawn if it were to push e6. And you're trying to drive the queen off this line. Like if he wants to try to stay on the e file, you would have to play a move like queen e1, and then after knight d5, e6. Again, black can just play f takes e6. And white probably is getting some play here by pushing f5. But in this position, black can just castle long. And here you probably should come after and try to round this pawn up. but maybe not. Maybe queen e3 is playable here, rook to e8. I mean, it's an interesting position. He may be able to get away with. No, it probably has to go in for this if he does it this way. And but I think black is doing fine in this position. And this bishop a3 is also a novelty. It's never been played. This position's only been reached 3 times after c6, and white played f5 in 2 of them. Bishop e3 is an interesting try. Black's best is probably just to castle, and then on a move like rook fd1, just play queen c8 or something. And although he's given up a pawn here, he has a lot of compensation, because these light squares are weak. So in this position, even though it's material equality, it's still interesting in an unbalanced position. I wouldn't say this is a dry position by any means. Both sides still have kingside majorities, even with the opposite color bishops. So I think black could also consider a move like bishop g4, queen f2, and then castles. But then there might be some play here. White might have some play like on these squares. Like after f5, queen d3, bishop d4. Well, actually, there black seems to be doing pretty well. So maybe h3 is the key move, just to make the bishop go somewhere. Because if it has to go back to d7, then bishop g4 was just a loss of time. So maybe castles first is better than playing bishop g4. I don't know. I haven't looked at that into this position a ton. And so bishop a3 is a move, bishop e3 is a move. But f5 is the main line of this variation, and that's probably what we should look at. It's just seeking to get the pawns rolling as quickly as possible. White's plan is to continue on and play e5. Then he also has this idea of bishop g5, which was made possible. So in this position, black should just castle, and white plays his plan of bishop g5, and he threatens to play e5. So in the game, Tkachiev played h6, and this worked out okay. I wouldn't say, Belyavsky played h6. Bishop takes f6 would just be everything that black wants in the position, even though white gets e5 in here. Black is doing fine here. In a position like this, the e6 pawn isn't as strong as it looks. It's potentially weak, and black is should be at least equal there. So Tkachiev played this move bishop h4, which makes a lot more sense, trying to keep the pieces on. And after this logical sequence of moves, you'll see that this is a common theme in the positions that I'm recommending, that black plays the rook a to e8 and then the bishop back to c8. But in this position, I think that g5 forces fg. I think that white could have had a little bit of an edge. Instead of taking back his pawn right away, if he played this move bishop e7, rook f1, bishop d7, I think that white has a little bit of an edge here. He's got the bishop pair, and even though he's still down a pawn, I think he has a lot of compensation. So I'm recommending something that I think is better than playing h6. We can go ahead and see how the game turned out after bishop takes c6. g5 takes. His piece is trapped, but then he got this move d7, and we could see that this pawn's about to queen, and so black had to take it back, and now we just have material equality. Black's rook is pretty active, but so is white's. So in this position, it was just a draw. But I think that black's play can be improved upon here by playing this interesting move, queen e7. And if he plays a move like, for example, e5, you can just pin it. And when he plays rook a d1, you just play bishop c8. And you always have this check. Once he plays rook e1 to guard the pawn, you have this check. And this position should be fine. In fact, here if he blocks with queen e3, you would win the pawn back, either with knight g4, which hits both e3 and e5, or if he took back with the bishop, you could just take back, with this rook on e5 immediately. And so, if e5, rook a, e8. And if he just plays a move like king h1 here, then he's sitting on bishop takes f5, and he's still in a pin. So black won the f5 pawn, and he's still free to just move his knight. And he also threatens bishop g4, etc., etc. So that would have just been a terrible move to play king h1. So that works out very well. So he can't play e5. In the meantime, black seeks to occupy this square eventually with his queen, and he's still going to play like rook a, e8 and bishop to c8, which is his normal setup. So white's best move is probably rook a d1. And then we just go ahead with our plan, and we ignore the fact that white has this quote-unquote threat to take on f6 and then take on d7, because we'll just let him do it. So after bishop takes f6, g takes f6, we've got doubled pawns, here and here, but it's really not that bad for us, because white's kingside play is kind of stopped because his extra pawn is now backward. And that's a key point, and it's really hard for him to roll this guy because it's covered in so many ways. And in the meantime, black has a simple plan of c5 and b4, and I think this is a lot harder for white to meet. So I think this is pretty good for black. And indeed on queen h5, like if he tries to just mate us, it is important that you always be watching out for these mating attacks. Like so here you need to play king h8, rook f4, rook g8, rook h4, rook g7. So those moves were forced to stop that mating sequence. But at this point, white really doesn't have any way to proceed. His kingside play is stopped, and now black is ready to just roll the queenside. So when white could try something like queen h6, but we could just play bishop back to c8, so that there's no like rook d7 and queen f6 ideas. And after something like a4, we continue our plan of occupying e5. And then we just play c5 and b4, and you could see that this would be a pretty good position for black with connected passed pawns. Yeah, so this, I think that black is probably okay here. I don't know that he's better because he does have some shattered pawn structures, and white has chances to make a pawn here, a passed pawn here, and this rook is really passive. But you can't discount connected passed pawns, so I think that this would be an interesting ending, and that black is doing fine. Certainly has his fair share of the play. So that's my novelty. I hope you like it. This queen e7 novelty idea. It's important to note that even though this novelty, you have to be careful about this bishop skewering, the queen and rook here. But there's no real way to set this up. Like if he plays a move like bishop f4 here, you can just play bishop takes f5, and if he goes bishop d6, you just have a check to get out of it. And in this position, you could just play knight takes e4 and ignore the fact that ignore the fact that bishop takes f8 is hanging, because in this position you could just play king takes, and even though we're down in exchange, we've got 3 pawns for it, and the c pawn is weak, and so this should be an easy win. And there are other positions where he could try to angle for that bishop f4 move, like if he plays queen e3, for example, rook here, rook a d1, bishop c8, again the same theme, bishop f4, now we have knight d5, and he doesn't really have anything better than he takes d5 here. And if he moves, the queen here, we just take on f4. So it's really hard for him to ever get this idea of skewering. And since e5 doesn't work, this queen e7 is really the move we want to play. Queen e7, rook a, e8, and bishop c8. So it forms a nice little system to play against this line. So the only other line we have to look at then, just to review, is so again we played against knight c3, we play bishop d6, queen e2, we play b5 and guard our pawn. Now if he delays e4 and plays rook d1, this is another system, but here we can just castle, because if he goes e4, e5, I may have already talked about this, I can't remember. Here we can actually capture the way we want to, which is with the bishop. And in this position we can play knight takes e5, and if he goes f4, when he goes f4 we can just play knight d3. And notice he doesn't have e5, e6. He can play e5, but we just play knight g4, and even though he gets wins an exchange here on a8, you know,